Hey Terrace CRC, just checking if things are working here. So for this video, I thought I would talk a little bit about my love for story and how that shapes my understanding of Scripture and my approach to preaching. I think I'll start with my memory from grade school in Europe, where we had the headmaster, the principal basically of the school, would teach Bible class. And he simply did that by opening a big Bible on his desk and then basically reading and retelling at the same time various stories from the Bible. And he was extremely engaging in doing that. And so I remember paying very close attention, just being wrapped up in what he was saying. In Europe at that time, there was actually a kind of a contest. If you think of like a spelling bee, there was kind of a contest you could enter called voorlezen, which was basically dramatic reading. So people would compete with each other doing dramatic readings. And I had aspirations to try and sign up for that at some point, partly inspired by this headmaster. We didn't stay in Europe long enough for that to actually happen, and in Canada something like that was not available. Another thing about this headmaster was that he was bald, and while he was presenting a story, if a fly would land on his head, he could quiver that piece of skin just like a cow can. And that was a fascinating thing to observe, as well as the stories themselves. So if I reflect on my love of stories, that's where some of it starts. Reading, of course, a lot as a child helps that. I was a voracious reader up until probably midway through high school. But recently in my life, I've also come to understand that I make sense of life through story. Sometimes I like to say there are two kinds of people in this world. Of course, that's just naming two extremes. But there are people who are proposition oriented, so they like statements. They like the motto of the story, the moral of the story, and stories don't interest them as much. And then on the other end of the scale, there are people who are story people like myself, and I would have a very hard time sharing a principle with you, a statement, a proposition, a conclusion, without having told the story that goes with it, showing why I come to that conclusion. So those are all factors for me, and it's really only in the last 10, maybe 20 years that I've started to kind of own this interest in story and to understand how I make sense of life by story. And that's partly evident in if you and I are talking and you tell me some aspect of your life, that will bring to mind for me a story out of my own life that is similar or that taught me something similar, things like that. Now, another thing that happened for me at some point along the way, and I have this written somewhere, but again, I'm trying to do these off the cuff, is that I remember distinctly, it must have been grade 11 high school in Hamilton, Ontario, in like biology class, we dissected a frog. And I'll try and get an image into this somehow of this. What I found was an image of what we achieved, recreated in Lego, so it's not so gross. But we were made into teams, and like I think 2 or 3 people, and then we were given in an aluminum tray with wax on the bottom, we were given a frog that had been treated somehow so that it was numb but awake, comfortably numb, we'll call it. And it was, so we had these steps that we had to do to, I think it was pinned down already on its back. And we had to notice in the steps various things about it. And then we would surgically, with a scalpel, cut it open. And we would open it up and see the beating heart and see the lungs. I remember we had to be cautious to not cut the skin too deep, because then you puncture the lung and the frog dies too soon. And so I just remember exploring that. Now, this might be partly imagined, but I think we got to a point where the frog was dead, and then we would cut the heart out and look at the shape of it and things like that. There were things to learn there. And one day when I was considering how preaching works for me, I realized that I was likely raised in an environment where that so-called scientific approach was taken to a text, a piece of scripture. And it was slowly examined and taken apart until the heart was found, and it would be lifted up. But the way that was all done, the passage would be kind of dead by the point we lifted up the heart of the matter, so to speak. And so I realized that somewhere along the way, unconsciously, without really thinking about it, I had tried for an approach to preaching where the frog stays alive while the heart is talked about. So in other words, you don't kill the parable by lifting out one phrase from it and saying, the rest doesn't matter, kind of a thing. So those are just a few thoughts about how I approach preaching and how I interpret my world and make sense of my world with stories. I'll add one little bit to that, because we recently had the trauma-informed Safe Church gathering. And that is, I've also noticed that when someone goes through something traumatic, the story they have to tell is rarely neatly organized by time or by sequence of activities. So in other words, the trauma of it jumbles the story. And people that study this have learned that if you can help the person reconstruct the story, the effect of the trauma can be reduced. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Catch you next video.